This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac. 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha is heard on 18 campus and community radio stations from Newfoundland to British Columbia. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak, and this is episode 299. If you're going to host and report for a program called Nasha Kasha, a Ukrainian Almanac, you should, for starters, know how to spell. I apparently do not, or at the very least did not notice when someone else misspelled an all-important word on my business cards. I am a volunteer. Why would I need business cards? The show sells no ads. I make no money from it. Cards cost money. Well, I concur, except that you end up writing your contact information on paper napkins and the backs of old envelopes. And that's neither right nor a good use of time or ballpoint ink. So, off to Quick Copy I went with a bounce in my step, my newly designed logo, my cell phone number, and the name of my new radio program. I remember my father bringing my good intent but lack of attention to detail up often. He would say, "Dva razy mirai, raz rubai." Measure twice, cut once. This when I'd be assigned to saw a piece of lumber at a required length. Job done, I would present it to him proudly. "The cut is excellent," he intoned, "but it's 1/8 of an inch too short. Had it been 1/8 of an inch too long, I could help you. But this piece of wood won't grow 1/8 of an inch. And now I need to augment it with another piece of wood. And that defeats the purpose of having one strong, solid, properly cut piece of wood." Had my father been around, he may have noticed the spelling mistake on my business card. Not a word of exaggeration now. It was 3 years into my program. I had given out a few hundred business cards when I noticed the mistake, which in polite company could be called a typo. You all seem very polite, so yeah, let's call it a typo. Which word, you ask? Ukrainian. I misspelled Ukrainian. The word Ukrainian was missing its first I. For everyone not having listened to my program, hearing me say that word, reading the card, they would think Nasha Kasha was a Ukrainian almanac. Little wonder, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada never called back. "But," I would tell my father, "these cards came in a batch of 500. There is one show left after this episode. I may just continue to hand the cards out." Here's Ron Cahoot with Buria and a song about another person my father might think was a yolop.
Їжджу, ходжу і блукаю, мало біфоркару маю, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Запряжу я фордяка, куда йде, туди я, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Поїхали до Єртону, пили водку, мали фону, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Так пішов на сен з готела, сен каже, ring my bell, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Вітер віє, 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 замітає, тає, тає, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Вітер віє, 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 замітає, тає, тає, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Довго там не заваджався, додому я забирався, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Вітер віє, заверуха, залетіла в гару муха, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Форденятко закурило, а потім ся і сказило, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Ой, заїхав я на пень, там сидів я ніч і день, вітер віє, замітає дорожку. Вітер віє, 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 замітає, тає, тає, вітер віє, замітає дорожку.
The song Viter Via translates as "The Wind It Blows," and it's about a funny character who lives life going with that wind, wherever it may carry him. I met with the station manager at 94.9 CHRW-FM here in London, Ontario, around this time of year in 2016. It wasn't the first time I had pitched a program about Ukrainian life, but I was new here. Other multicultural broadcasters had been doing a show for years, in some cases, decades. No available time, I was told. The so-called ethnic block of programs was relegated to Saturdays and Sundays, and unless you wanted your program to be heard at 5 in the morning, you were out of luck. But something big had changed in 2016. Andrew Barton was now the manager. Secondly, and this is key, my program would be for everyone. Ukrainian stories would be about undiscovered gems as well as about those who are at the fulcrum of Ukrainian Canadian life. I wanted to travel, to reach into crevices and to welcome remarkable stories about everyday people, some of whom neither spoke Ukrainian nor belonged to any official organization. If they said, hey, my Baba on my mother's side, I think, was half Ukrainian, I'd ask, so tell me the story. In short, the show wasn't an ethnic show. I argued it could be enjoyed by a wide general audience at all times of day. Andrew agreed enthusiastically, introduced me to others at the station. Meet Stefan of Nasha Kasha. I had spent my working life in broadcast journalism, but, like every other volunteer, I'd have to study the handbook and attend training sessions. I was impressed at how thorough they were, and have since learned that this would be standard practice at all 18 community radio stations now airing Nasha Kasha. Thankfully, I'd only have to go through training once. The other requirement I'd have to fulfill before going on air was a 3-hour-long overnight shift. And so it was that I found myself in front of a microphone speaking with no one else inside the station. A campus security guard opened the door quietly and came up over my shoulder. He startled me. After a brief explanation, he resumed his rounds elsewhere. Author Garrison Keillor hosted a program on Minnesota Public Broadcasting on radio for 42 years. It was called A Prairie Home Companion. Keillor tells the story when he was a young man of falling in love from afar because she didn't notice him, falling in love with a young woman who adored classical music. He couldn't quite muster the courage to ask her out at that time, but he joined the campus radio station and volunteered to host just such a show late evenings. Classical music under the stars. He envisioned the young woman studying late into the night, hearing his voice, or getting ready for bed, listening to the radio. Now she would certainly know who he was when he asked her out. Late one night, the studio door flips open, and the station's engineer demands to know what it was he thought he was doing there. The radio station transmitter had not been functioning for weeks. Garrison Keillor had been talking to himself. That's what it felt like speaking on air into the night, wondering if anyone was listening. But late night brought with it a chance to practice. It also provided a touch of humility and a lesson. Do the best show you possibly can, no matter who is listening. Do it, even for an audience of one. These are the Kapusta kids, and Hopak. Kapusta in Ukrainian is cabbage, so you might say they're the cabbage kids. The book on the night table by my bed this week is Late Nights on Air. It's a novel by Elizabeth Hay, which earned her a Giller Prize. The book is set in Yellowknife in 1975. Its characters work at a little radio station, and each has ended up in that northern city looking for something very personal. For each of them, it's different, but for all, whatever that is has eluded them so far in life. It's lunchtime. The acting station manager, his name is Harry, has invited Gwen for a beer. Gwen is a rookie. She has tried to read the news for a couple of weeks, and she has faltered badly. The old hands at the station have told their boss she's got to go. But Harry has a hard time breaking bad news, particularly because Gwen is someone he thinks could actually become very good with practice. So he's going to put her on the night shift. We'll pick the story up on page 69. Quote, "Radio was like poetry," he told her, while television was like a blockbuster novel. A radio program, it's not showbiz. It's not an assault. It's about one person learning something interesting and telling it to somebody else. You're speaking to one person. Remember that. End of quote. Okay, Stefan, but how many people actually listen to Nasha Kasha? And I have been asked. Because the show is aired on community radio stations, and community radio does not sell advertising, the organizations that gather ratings numbers do not bother with community radio. I pay an organization called Libsyn a modest monthly fee to syndicate the show to streaming services, podcast distributors like iTunes, Spotify, and elsewhere. I understand that last month there were 1,144 listeners in Canada, 836 in the US, 113 in Ukraine, 40 in Spain and Portugal, and a smattering elsewhere around the world. But Harry is right. I think of one person who I respect, and in my mind, I'm talking to that one person sitting across the table from me. From the album Variances Paris to Kyiv, here is Alexis Gochan. Dance 1. I have a confession to make. I intended to post the final 4 programs of Nasha Kasha from my archives. That was before I made the tactical error of telling my friend, Stefan Voloshchak. Stefan lives in a Hamilton hospital. He FaceTimes me every second day, sometimes more often if he's feeling chatty. I am one of 10, maybe 20 people on his list of regular calls. Because it's FaceTime, I can see him. He can see me. Every morning that he can leave his bed, he dresses in a suit, shirt and tie, ready to partake in his day. He's a voracious reader, and he loves to debate. Stefan has lived on his hospital's complex care floor for more than 16 years. When he arrived at the hospital, he was near death. Stefan had been diagnosed at birth. He grew up in the embrace of his family and his community, traveling, studying, leading the youth wing of a political party in Windsor, Ontario. Suddenly, tests revealed that one of the factors that had allowed him to function normally was tainted, and that the outcome would be fatal. His life crashed. Doctors, staff, good medicine, and Stefan himself saved him. Stefan has gone on to form close relationships with residents living in neighboring rooms. His own chronic illness, he knows, is only one part of his life. He can attend church services today in the chapel on the main floor of the hospital. He loves hanging out at the coffee shop where he buys surprised visitors and staff coffee and donuts. Well, the donut buying stopped with COVID, but the coffee, he still does this. When he calls me, it's a reminder for me to step away from my computer screen or from whatever else of self-importance I might be doing at the time. To breathe. If I can't answer, I make sure to call him back. I know he's probably going to bug me to sing with him in Ukrainian, and he wants the words to some songs. And sing he does, loudly. I find real joy in his joy. I told Stefan, it takes me an average of 3 days to complete an episode of Nasha Kasha. Pre-COVID, add another day on average for travel and for interviews. I told him, Stefan, I'm bagged. I've decided to end the program at episode 300 anyway. I've announced it. From now until then, I told Stefan, I'll post a few of my favorite shows. Without missing a beat, Stefan told me, you're better than that. So I'm listening to you, Stefan. That is why I'm sharing stories from my personal notebook, never for a minute downplaying the happiness that it gave me to have recorded those programs. Stefane, дякую тобі.
Дякую тобі за те, що ти завжди зі мною. І навіть так, як і я хотів, і не без бою, але й без непотрібних слів. Дякую тобі за те, що ти завжди зі мною. Я живу не так, як всі, як за стіною, але з любов'ю на душі. Але з тобою я світу дам нове життя.
Okean Elzy and their song, Thank You. Дякую тобі.
Оція ярма, оцію цію ха-ха, оція ярема, мудролова. Оція ярма, оцію цію ха-ха, оція ярема, мудролова.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from Radio Western 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on Local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 FM in Saint Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor and Detroit, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CJTR 91.3 FM in Regina, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, on CJSF 90.1 FM in Vancouver, and on CHLY 101.7 FM in Nanaimo, British Columbia. The Banzirka playing Otsayayarama, a happy-go-lucky, clever fellow. It was interspersed cleverly with the theme from the TV show Bonanza, proving conclusively that Yarama is not the only one with a mudra holova.
Otsayayarama, otsiyutsiyu kaka, otsayayarama, mudra holova. Otsayayarama, otsiyutsiyu kaka, otsayayarama, mudra holova.
Joan Didion, who died at age 87, the week before Christmas, inspired writers and readers for decades. Her journalism, her memoirs, her cultural and political commentary made her a unique chronicler of 20th century culture. So writes Vogue magazine, a publication that she once edited. In her memoir, A Book of Common Prayer, she wrote, quote, "You have to pick the places you don't walk away from." In 2012, I had the privilege of serving as president of the Ontario Council of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. That organization gave me a unique bond with provincial councils across Canada, and I treasured the work that UCC did in communities large and small, promoting and realizing education, speaking truth to power, reaching out to one and all of Ukrainian heritage, no matter how remote or how distant that heritage was. Then in the fall of 2015, a pivot. Because of the crisis in Ukraine, the Canadian organization would de-emphasize its development of communities in Canada to focus exclusively on Ukraine. The dissolution of the community development portfolio came without warning. I understood that Ukraine was important. I did not understand why we had to leave Canadians who were wondering about their roots behind in the margins. There is new leadership at the Congress today, and the outreach in Canada as well as its public support for Ukraine are equally exemplary. But back then, back in 2016, Nasha Kasha, I thought, could be one reporter's search for everyday people living life remarkably. Struggles, accomplishments no one notices because those behind them are so modest and unassuming. And those stories are the best stories. The tool and die specialist at General Motors who joined a company culture committee and decided to build a better bandura. A soldier returns to Kingston after 2 stints in Afghanistan, spoke fondly of his studying the trumpet as a young man. Now battle-hardened, scarred, divorced, he is living with post-traumatic stress, and I can see that he's hurting. Finds peace playing horn with the Salvation Army at their church. There was my car trip to Sault Ste. Marie and then north to Thunder Bay with New Pathway columnist Walter Kish. We shared the driving. Wanting to save money, I booked us into what can only generously be described as a men's hostel. Walking up the front steps, I felt something against my back, for just as we were passing it, at that very instant, a rotting flagpole had cracked, bounced off of me, and grazed Walter's nose. He applied ice. I called the nearest hotel. During Kasha's early years, he and I would visit Rouyn-Noranda, Kirkland Lake, and Amos, Quebec, site of the Spirit Lake internment camp. A dance instructor in Kelowna, British Columbia, who gathered kids and named the group after a tumbleweed. Some of the Pocatello dancers are now saving money to study technique in Ukraine. Dance has become their life. The astronomer from Ukraine who had to learn French to teach at a Moncton University and did, going on to co-publish a new discovery about the sun. The veterinary science technician who, in Prince Edward Island, raises a unique breed of dogs from Turkey on her acreage and wins awards writing about them. A former prison guard in Sudbury who retired, married in Ukraine, returned to Canada, but his wife's grown son waited too long to emigrate with them. We learned of his campaign to reunite him with his mother. The legacy of Senator Paul Usick, who fostered multiculturalism in Canada as seen through the eyes of his children. Before visiting Kelowna, British Columbia, I didn't know that Pocatello was Ukrainian for tumbleweed. Makes sense to me now. Pocatello is Ukrainian for something tumbled. Pocatellosia, of course. In Victoria, I met Victoria Grando, who, as a child in Ukraine, was fascinated by her grandfather's globe. Look, in Canada, he would say, they named a city after you. Victoria grew up, found her way to Victoria, BC, married. Now she's head of that city's Ukrainian center. When settlers out west cleared their land of rocks, they'd put them on a horse-drawn sled called a stone boat to drag them to the edge of their fields out of the way so they could plant. Larissa and I met a couple in their vineyard in Oliver, BC, successful but never having forgotten the labor of their ancestors. Their award-winning vintage today can be found under the name Stoneboat. In Red Deer, I met a couple who had moved there to escape the memory of a fatal car crash on the outskirts of London, Ontario. The crash robbed them of their little girl's life. They had settled in Canada, had hope, now only emptiness. I was honored that they trusted me to tell their story. In Edmonton, I sat in on a rehearsal. The ensemble is called Broken Banjos. There are no banjos in the group, Should anyone ask, everybody asks. You know, everybody asks. They'll tell you there are no banjos, they're broken. In Winnipeg, I had a chance to record my cousin Mary's story about the diner her mother and her sister and she ran in the Exchange District. It was called Pat's Lunch. Regulars, many of whom worked in the Garment District and at a nearby police station, to this day remember them fondly. It was Joan Didion who also said, "Report on what's in front of you." I interviewed my Aunt Catherine before she died, the coolest person I knew when I was a kid. Once, after disagreeing with my own parents, I hopped on my bicycle and left home, thinking I would pedal my way from Montreal to Toronto and into her arms. But it was supper time, and I was hungry. So, after a couple of kilometers, I turned around and went home. Then there's the one story I recorded and have never aired. A former alcoholic, having joined AA, was now mentoring men with drinking problems in Ukraine by computer. Holding Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, communicating by computer. Groundbreaking. Before I left his home, he said to me, "But what I just told you, what you've recorded, it's confidential." One of the pillars of our organization is, he said, that we take no credit personally for what we do. I had traveled for this interview a long distance, one he had agreed to give me. When I telephoned him to reconsider, he said no. And so his name, his location, I will never publish. But I do want you to know that some really good people are out there, and that there are stories like this for everyone about Ukrainian life. This is Evan Wish performing his composition, The Man That I Am. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha has been provided by the Shevchenko Foundation and by the Ukrainian Credit Union. I'm your reporter Stefan Andrusiak. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.